Hello, my name is Florian Johnson, and I'm here to read you a chapter of The Ranger's Apprentice, The Burning Bridge. I will be starting with Chapter 1. It was close to midnight when the single rider reined in his horse outside the small cottage set in the trees below Castle Redmont. The laden-pack pony trailing behind the saddle horse ambled to a halt as well. The rider, a tall man who moved with the easy grace of youth, swung down from the saddle and stepped up onto the narrow veranda. Stooping to avoid the low-lying eaves, from the lean-to stable at the side of the house came the sound of a gentle nickering, and his own horse's head rose as he answered the greetings. The rider had raised his fist to knock at the door when he saw a light come on behind the curtained windows. He hesitated. The light moved across the room, and a second or so later the door opened before him. "Gillian," Holt said, without any note of surprise in his voice. "What are you doing here?" The young ranger laughed incredulously as he faced his former teacher. "How do you do it, Holt?" he asked. "How could you possibly know it was me arriving in the middle of the night, before you'd even opened the door?" Holt shrugged, gesturing for Gillian to enter the house. He closed the door behind him and moved to the neat little kitchen opening. The dampening vent on the stove and sent new life flaring into the wood coals inside. He tossed a handful of kindling onto the stove and a set of copper kettle on the hot plate over the fire chamber, shaking it first to make sure there is plenty of water in it. "I heard your horse some minutes ago," he finally said. "Then, when I heard Abelard call a greeting, I knew it had to be a ranger's horse." He shrugged again. "Simple when you explained it," the gesture said. Gillian laughed again in reply. "Well, that narrowed it down to 50 people, didn't it?" he said. Holt cocked his head to one side with a pity look. "Gillian, I must have heard you stumbling up that front step 1,000 times when you were studying with me," he said. "Give me credit for recognizing that sound once more." The younger ranger spread his hands in a gesture of defeat. He unclasped his cloak and hung it over the back of a chair, moving a little closer to the stove. It was a chilly night, and he watched Holt measuring coffee into a pot with some anticipation. The door to the rear room of the house opened, and Will entered the small living room, his clothes pulled on hastily over his nightshirt, his hair still tousled from sleep. "Evening, Gillian," he said casually. "What brings you here?" Gillian looked from one to the other in something like despair. "Isn't anybody surprised when I turn up in the middle of the night?" he asked. "Of no one in particular." Holt, busy by the stove, turned away to hide a grin. A few minutes earlier he heard Will moving hurriedly to the window as the horses drew closer to the cottage. Obviously, his apprentice had overheard Holt's exchange with Gillian, and he was doing his best to emulate his own casual approach to the unexpected arrival. However, knowing Will as he did, Holt was sure that the boy was burning with curiosity over the reason for Gillian's sudden appearance. He decided he'd call his bluff. "It's late, Will," he said. "You may as well go back to bed. We have a busy day tomorrow." Instantly, Will's nonchalant expression was replaced by a stricken look. The suggestion from his master was tantamount to an order. All thought of appearing casual departed instantly. "Oh, please, Holt," the boy exclaimed. "I want to know what's going on." Holt and Gillian exchanged a quick grin. Will was actually hopping from one foot to another as he waited for Halt to rescind the suggestion that he could go to bed, or that he should go to bed. The grizzled ranger kept a straight face as he set 3 steaming mugs of coffee on the kitchen table. "Just as well as I made 3 cups then, isn't it?" he said, and Will realized that he'd been having his leg pulled. He shrugged, grinning, and sat down with his 2 seniors. "Very well, Gillian. Before my apprentice explodes with curiosity, what is the reason for this unexpected visit?" "Well, it has to do with those battle plans you discovered last week. Now that we know what Morgarath has in mind, the king wants the army ready on the plains of Uthal before the dark of the next moon. That's when Morgarath plans to break out through 3-Step Pass." The capture document had told them a great deal. Morgarath's plan called for 500 Scandian mercenaries to make their way through the swamps of the Fenlands and attack the Ireland garrison at 3-Step Pass. With the pass undefended, Morgarath's main army of wargals would be able to break out and deploy into battle order on the plains. "So Duncan plans to beat him to the punch," Halt said, nodding slowly. "Good thinking. That way we can control the battlefield." Will nodded in his turn and said in an equally grave voice, "And we'll keep Morgarath's army bottled up in the pass." Gillian turned slightly to hide a grin. He wondered if he had tried to copy Halt's mannerism when he was an apprentice, and decided that he probably had. "On the contrary," he said, "once the army's in place, Duncan plans to withdraw the garrison, then fall back to prepared positions, and let Morgarath out onto the plains." "Let him out?" Will's voice went up in a pitch with surprise. "Is the king crazy? Why would—" He realized that both rangers were looking at him, Halt with one eyebrow raised, and Gillian with a quizzical smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "I mean," he hesitated, not sure if questioning the king's sanity might constitute treason. "No offense or anything like that. It's just—" "Oh, I'm sure the king wouldn't be offended to hear that a lowly apprentice ranger thought he was crazy," said Halt. "Kings usually love to hear that sort of thing." "But Halt, to let him out after all these years, it seems—" He was about to say crazy again, but thought better of it. He thought suddenly of his recent encounter with the wargals. The idea of thousands of those vile beasts streaming unopposed out of the pass made his blood run cold. It was Halt who answered first. "That's just the point, Will. After all these years, we spent 16 years looking over our shoulder at Morgarath, wondering what he's up to. In that time, we've had many of our forces tied up patrolling the base of the cliffs and keeping watch over 3-Step. And he's been free to strike us at any time he likes. The Kalkara were the latest example, as you know only too well." Gillian glanced admiringly at his former teacher. Halt had instantly seen the reasoning behind the king's path, not for the first time. He understood why Halt was one of the king's most respected advisors. "Halt's right, Will," he said. "And there's another reason. After 16 years of relative peace, people are growing complacent. Not the rangers, of course, but the village people who provide men at arms for our army, and even some of the barons and battle masters in remote fiefs to the north. You've seen for yourself how reluctant some people are to leave their farms and go to war, Halt put in. Will nodded. He and Halt had spent the past week traveling to outlying villages in Redmont, Fife, to raise the levies of men who would make up the bulk of the army. One more than On more than one occasion, they had been met with outright hostility. Hostility that melted away as Halt exerted the full force of his personality reputation. As far as King Duncan is concerned, now is the time to settle this, Gillian continued. We're as strong as we'll ever be, and any delay will only weaken us. This is the best opportunity we'll have to get rid of Morgoth once and for all. All of which still begs my original question, Halt says. What brings you here in the middle of the night? Orders of Crowley, Gillian said crisply. He placed a written dispatch on the table in Halt after an inquiring look at Gillian, unrolled it, and read it. Crowley was the commandant of the Rangers. Will knew the most senior of all the 50 Rangers in the corps. Halt read, then rolled the orders closed again. So you're taking dispatches to King Swindon of the Celts? He said. I assume you're invoking the mutual defense treaty that Duncan signed with him some years ago? Gillian nodded, sipping appreciatively at the fragrant coffee. The king feels we're going to need all the troops we can muster. Halt nodded thoughtfully. I can fault his thinking there, he said softly. But he spread his hands in a questioning gesture. If Gillian were taking dispatches to Celtica, the sooner he got on with it, the better. The gesture seems to say. Well, said Gillian, it's an official embassy to Celtica. He laid a little stress on the last word, and suddenly Halt nodded his understanding. Of course, he said. The old Celtic tradition. Superstition, more like it, Gillian answered, shaking his head. It's a ridiculous waste of time, as far as I'm concerned. Of course it is, Halt replied, but the Celts insist on it, so what can you do? Will looked from Halt to Gillian and back again. The two rangers seemed to understand what they were talking about. So well, they might as well have been speaking Spaniard. It's all very well in normal times, Gillian said, but with all these preparations for war, we're stretching thin in every area. We simply don't have the people to spare, so Crowley thought. I think I'm ahead of you, said Halt, and finally, Will could bear it no longer. Well, I'm way behind you, he burst out. What on earth are you two talking about? You're speaking Ireland, aren't you? And not some strange foreign tongue that just sounds like it, but makes no sense at all. That's the end of the chapter. Thank you.